The alert klaxon screamed across Edwards Air Force Base at 0347 hours, its piercing wail cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. In the operations center, radar screens painted an impossible picture. 15 unidentified aircraft had breached American airspace, flying in perfect formation toward the West Coast. Every available pilot was scrambling to intercept. Every pilot except one, Lieutenant Sarah Chun, stood in the empty hangar bay, her flight suit perfectly pressed, her helmet gleaming under the fluorescent lights, watching through the reinforced windows as F-22 Raptors roared down the runway without her. She'd been grounded for 3 weeks, deemed unsuitable for active combat operations by her commanding officer. But in 47 minutes, when those interceptors reached the edge of their fuel reserves, and the enemy formation was still advancing, Sarah Chun would prove that sometimes the most dangerous pilot is the one they refuse to let fly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert wind howled across the tarmac of Edwards Air Force Base, carrying with it the acrid smell of jet fuel and the distant thunder of afterburners. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had been at the base for 8 months, and every sunrise brought the same crushing routine. While 26 male pilots dominated the flight schedules, Sarah found herself assigned to ground support, maintenance checks, and endless paperwork reviews. She had earned her position through exceptional performance at the Air Force Academy, graduating 3rd in her class with flight scores that shattered several Academy records. Her precision in aerial maneuvers during training exercises had instructed her fellow cadets, and her tactical understanding of air-to-air combat scenarios consistently impressed even veteran instructors. Yet here at Edwards, one of the most prestigious fighter pilot training facilities in the world, those achievements seemed to count for nothing. The morning briefings were always the same theater of exclusion. Colonel James Mitchell, the base commander, would stride into the operations room with his usual air of military authority, scanning the assembled pilots before his eyes inevitably skipped past Sarah entirely. The mission assignments followed a predictable pattern. Rodriguez and Thompson would take the advanced intercept training. Harrison and Burke would handle the high-altitude reconnaissance simulations, and Chun would be relegated to flight deck supervision. Today's exercise involves multiple bogey scenarios. Colonel Mitchell announced that Tuesday morning, his voice carrying across the briefing room. We'll be testing response times and coordination under extreme pressure conditions. He gestured toward the tactical display showing various flight patterns and intercept vectors. Rodriguez, you'll lead Alpha flight. Thompson, take Beta. Harrison handles Gamma formation. Sarah waited, knowing what was coming but hoping against experience that this time would be different. The colonel's gaze swept past her position near the back of the room, and he continued with equipment checks and weather reports without acknowledging her presence. The other pilots filed out toward the flight line, discussing tactics and joking about who would score the most simulated kills. Sarah remained seated, reviewing the mission parameters she wouldn't be flying, studying the aerial photography and intelligence reports she wouldn't be using. Through the window, she watched the F-22 Raptors taxi toward the runway, their engines screaming with barely contained power. Growing up in Oregon, Sarah had spent countless hours at small airfields with her father, a commercial airline pilot, who'd served briefly in the Air Force before transitioning to civilian aviation. He'd taught her the basics of flight theory, weather reading, and aircraft systems. But those were simple lessons compared to what she'd learned later. What her fellow pilots didn't know was that her father had deliberately kept his own military background vague, never mentioning the specialized training he'd received or the classified missions he'd flown during his service years. The discrimination at Edwards wasn't subtle. During equipment inspections, Sarah's gear faced scrutiny that bordered on harassment. Maintenance Chief Master Sergeant Dale, Morrison had developed a routine of discovering microscopic flaws in her flight equipment that somehow escaped notice when inspecting male pilots' gear. Her helmet would have a barely visible scratch requiring replacement. Her oxygen system would need recalibration for reasons that were never clearly explained. Her flight suit would fail inspection for creases that existed only in Morrison's imagination. The psychological pressure was more sophisticated, and therefore more damaging than simple insults. During tactical briefings, she'd be asked to explain complex aerial maneuvers under time pressure that would challenge even experienced combat pilots. "Chun," Morrison would call out during a session on evasive flying techniques. "You've got multiple SAM sites tracking your aircraft, enemy fighters closing from 3 directions, and your wingman has taken damage. Walk me through your defensive strategy in 30 seconds or less." These scenarios were designed to overwhelm, created specifically to make her stumble in front of her peers. Even when Sarah provided correct tactical responses, Morrison would find technical details to critique. "Close, but you failed to account for the electronic warfare environment at that altitude. In actual combat, that oversight gets your entire flight killed." The isolation was methodical and complete. During mealtimes in the officers' mess, conversations would shift when Sarah approached tables. Study groups formed without her inclusion. When flying schedules were posted, she'd find herself consistently assigned to the least desirable time slots, flying training missions alone while others practiced formation flying and combat tactics in groups. Captain Marcus Webb emerged as the most vocal critic of Sarah's presence at Edwards. Webb had 3 combat deployments under his belt and commanded significant respect among the younger pilots. His opposition to female fighter pilots wasn't expressed through crude comments or obvious hostility, but through carefully crafted arguments that sounded professionally reasonable. "Listen, I support women in military service," Webb would say. During informal discussions in the pilot's lounge, his tone suggesting reasoned consideration rather than prejudice. But when you're pulling 8 Gs in a dogfight with enemy missiles tracking your aircraft, you need absolute confidence in your wingman's capabilities. If the command has reservations about Chun's readiness for combat operations, maybe there's something we should consider. The comment would spread through subtle repetition. Other pilots began expressing similar concerns, not about women in general, but about this specific pilot who seemed to generate doubt among the leadership. Sarah could feel the shift in how her colleagues viewed her, not as an equal competitor for limited flying opportunities, but as a potential liability whose presence might compromise mission effectiveness. The breaking point seemed to arrive during a routine training exercise in her 6th month at Edwards. Sarah had been assigned to fly a basic navigation mission, a simple round-trip flight to predetermined coordinates that required minimal skill or tactical knowledge. It was the kind of assignment typically given to student pilots in their first week of training, designed more to occupy her time than to develop any meaningful capabilities. During the pre-flight inspection, Morrison discovered what he claimed was a hydraulic fluid leak in her assigned aircraft. The leak was barely visible, requiring a flashlight and magnifying glass to detect, but regulations demanded the aircraft be grounded for maintenance. Sarah's mission was canceled, and she spent the day in the hangar watching technicians search unsuccessfully for the source of a leak that may never have existed. "Maybe it's better this way," Webb commented when he heard about the canceled flight. "If there's any doubt about aircraft safety, it's not worth the risk, especially for training missions that don't require our most experienced pilots." The incident became another data point in the growing narrative about Sarah's suitability for flying duties. Not because of any failure on her part, but because mechanical problems seemed to follow her assignments with suspicious frequency. Other pilots began to view her as somehow cursed, a pilot whose aircraft developed mysterious problems that grounded training missions and disrupted schedules. But Sarah harbored a secret that would soon change everything they thought they knew about Her capabilities. Hidden in her personal quarters was a collection of items that told a very different story about her family's aviation background. Her father's military records, obtained through careful research after his death 2 years earlier, revealed a combat history that had been deliberately obscured. Flight logs from classified missions, commendations for aerial combat excellence, and training records that documented skills far beyond basic pilot certification. More importantly, Sarah had been receiving advanced flight training since childhood. Not from her father's commercial aviation background, but from weekend visits to a small private airfield, where a family friend provided instruction that went far beyond standard civilian flying lessons. Those weekend sessions had continued through high school and college, building capabilities that her Air Force Academy training had only begun to reveal. The training had been conducted in secrecy, partly because of her father's concerns about military politics, but mainly because the instructor preferred to work outside official channels. Sarah had learned aerial combat techniques that weren't taught in standard military curricula, developed instincts for three-dimensional tactical thinking that typically required years of combat experience to acquire, and mastered aircraft control. Skills that bordered on supernatural. As Sarah sat in that briefing room, watching her colleagues prepare for missions she wasn't allowed to fly, she knew that the real test was approaching. The increasing tensions in international airspace, the growing frequency of intercept missions, and the persistent rumors about hostile aircraft probing American defenses all pointed toward an inevitable crisis. When that crisis arrived, Edwards Air Force Base would discover that their assumptions about Lieutenant Sarah Chun were not just wrong, but catastrophically incomplete. The pilot they dismissed as unsuitable for combat operations was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy doesn't know you possess. The stage was set for a revelation that would shatter every assumption about combat aviation, female pilots, and the true meaning of aerial superiority. But first, Sarah would have to survive the systematic campaign designed to break her spirit and force her to request a transfer to a less demanding assignment. As the sun climbed higher over the desert, casting long shadows across the runway where she wasn't allowed to fly, Sarah Chun prepared for battles that would be fought not just in the sky, but in the minds of every person who had decided she didn't belong among America's elite fighter pilots. The campaign against Sarah intensified. During her 7th month at Edwards, evolving from casual dismissal into something far more calculated and dangerous, Colonel Mitchell had moved beyond simply excluding her from prime flying assignments. He was now actively documenting what he characterized as performance deficiencies that existed only in carefully constructed reports. The documentation began with flight simulation evaluations. Every pilot at Edwards underwent regular simulator training, practicing everything from basic maneuvers to complex combat scenarios in sophisticated computer-controlled environments. For most pilots, these sessions served as skill maintenance and tactical development. For Sarah, they became elaborate traps designed to generate negative performance reviews. Her simulator sessions were scheduled during off-peak hours when equipment malfunctions were most likely, often using older systems that hadn't received recent software updates. The scenarios programmed for her evaluation were consistently more challenging than those assigned to male pilots of equivalent experience levels. While others practiced standard intercept procedures against single bogies, Sarah faced multiple enemy aircraft with advanced countermeasures and electronic warfare capabilities. During one particularly manipulative session, the simulator technician, Staff Sergeant Kevin Fletcher, introduced system malfunctions that weren't part of the official training scenario. Sarah's simulated aircraft experienced hydraulic failures, radar malfunctions, and communication blackouts that forced her to navigate complex aerial combat situations with severely degraded capabilities. Interesting reaction time on the emergency procedures, Fletcher commented afterward, reviewing the session data with apparent concern. Most pilots would have initiated emergency landing protocols much sooner. Your decision to continue engaging hostile aircraft with compromised systems shows concerning judgment. The evaluation report would note Sarah's reluctance to prioritize aircraft preservation over mission completion and her potentially reckless approach to emergency situations. What the report wouldn't mention was that Sarah had successfully eliminated all simulated threats while managing multiple aircraft emergencies simultaneously, demonstrating flying skills that bordered on impossible. Captain Webb escalated his campaign by organizing informal discussions among the pilot corps about combat readiness standards. These conversations, carefully timed when Sarah was present but not participating, focused on the abstract question of how personal relationships and emotional considerations might compromise military effectiveness. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was reading about some of the air forces that have integrated women into combat roles. Webb would begin, his tone suggesting academic interest rather than personal agenda. The research shows some interesting challenges around unit cohesion and stress response under extreme conditions. The discussions would continue with other pilots contributing observations about gender differences in reaction time, spatial awareness, and decision-making under pressure. None of the comments were explicitly directed at Sarah, but the implication was unmistakable. Female pilots represented inherent limitations that could compromise mission success and endanger other aircrew members. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, no relation to the maintenance chief, but equally committed to maintaining traditional hierarchies, became Webb's most reliable ally in these psychological operations. Morrison had graduated from the Air Force Academy 2 years behind Sarah, but had arrived at Edwards 6 months earlier, giving him seniority in the informal pilot ranking system. It's not about capability in a general sense, Morrison would explain. During these carefully orchestrated conversations, it's about optimization. We've got limited aircraft, limited training time, and unlimited threats. Every training slot we assign has to maximize our combat effectiveness. The logic was seductive, because it sounded strategically sound rather than personally motivated. By framing the exclusion of female pilots as a resource allocation issue rather than discrimination, Webb and Morrison could maintain professional credibility while systematically undermining Sarah's position at the base that the isolation campaign extended beyond professional settings into the social infrastructure that held military units together. Edwards Air Force Base operated like a small city, with recreational facilities, social events, and informal gathering places where pilots built personal relationships that translated into professional trust and cooperation. Sarah found herself excluded from the weekly poker games where pilots discussed upcoming missions and shared tactical insights. The basketball games at the base gymnasium somehow never had room for additional players when she expressed interest. Weekend barbecues at off-base locations were organized through informal networks that somehow never included her in their communication loops. The exclusion was particularly painful because Sarah had always excelled in team environments. During her Air Force Academy years, she'd been a natural leader who brought diverse groups together around shared objectives. Her tactical insights had helped study groups master complex material, and her competitive drive had pushed entire training flights to achieve higher performance standards. At Edwards, those same leadership qualities were reinterpreted as threatening or inappropriate. When Sarah offered tactical suggestions during mission planning sessions, her contributions were politely acknowledged and then ignored. When she demonstrated superior knowledge of aircraft systems or aerial combat theory, her expertise was dismissed as excessive preparation that indicated lack of natural flying instincts. The psychological pressure reached a new level when Colonel Mitchell instituted what he called enhanced evaluation protocols, specifically for pilots whose performance required additional monitoring. Sarah was the only pilot subjected to these protocols, which required daily performance reports, weekly psychological assessments, and monthly review sessions with senior command staff. The psychological assessments were conducted by Captain Lisa Rodriguez, a clinical psychologist whose questions seemed designed to uncover personality traits that might disqualify Sarah from flying duties. The sessions began with standard military psychological evaluation procedures, but quickly evolved into detailed explorations of Sarah's motivations, family background, and personal relationships. I'm noticing some patterns in your responses that suggest difficulty with authority relationships, Rodriguez would observe during their third session. You seem to have very strong opinions about how things should be done, even when those opinions conflict with established procedures. The observation was based on Sarah's honest answers about her frustration with being excluded from flying assignments despite her superior academic and simulation performance, her willingness to question decisions that seemed based on prejudice rather than merit was characterized as insubordination and poor adaptability to military hierarchy. There's also the question of emotional regulation under stress. Rodriguez continued, reviewing notes from previous sessions. Military aviation requires pilots who can maintain absolute emotional control under extreme pressure. Some of your responses suggest that you might allow personal feelings to influence professional decision-making. The assessment was a masterpiece of circular logic. Sarah's frustration with discriminatory treatment was evidence of emotional instability, while acceptance of that treatment would have indicated lack of competitive drive necessary for combat aviation. Either response could be interpreted as disqualifying, depending on the evaluator's predetermined conclusions. Meanwhile, the actual flying opportunities continued to dwindle. Sarah's flight hours, already limited compared to her male colleagues, were further reduced through a series of administrative decisions that always had plausible explanations. Aircraft maintenance schedules were adjusted to reduce availability during her assigned flight times. Weather conditions that were acceptable for other pilots. Training missions became too risky when Sarah was scheduled to fly. The most insidious aspect of the campaign was how her colleagues began to internalize and repeat the narrative about her unsuitability for combat aviation. Pilots who had initially been neutral or even supportive started expressing concerns based on the constant stream of negative evaluations and performance reviews. I hate to say it, but maybe there's something to the concerns about Chun, Lieutenant. David Park confided to another pilot after reviewing the latest round of evaluation reports. The documentation is pretty consistent about decision-making issues and adaptability problems. Park had no way of knowing that the documentation was based on manipulated scenarios, biased evaluations, and deliberately misleading interpretations of Sarah's actions. From his perspective, multiple senior officers and evaluation specialists were raising legitimate concerns about a fellow pilot's readiness for combat operations. The campaign's effectiveness lay in its apparent objectivity, rather than relying on obvious discrimination or personal attacks. Colonel Mitchell had created a systematic process that generated official documentation supporting predetermined conclusions. Sarah's exclusion from prime flying assignments could be justified through performance evaluations, psychological assessments, and risk management protocols that appeared professionally sound. But Sarah had begun to understand the true nature of what she was facing. During quiet moments in her quarters, she reviewed the evaluation reports and identified patterns that revealed the systematic nature of the opposition. The scenarios designed to make her fail, the equipment malfunctions that occurred with suspicious frequency, and the psychological assessments that interpreted strength as weakness all pointed to coordinated effort rather than legitimate concern. More importantly, she had begun preparing her response. The advanced training she'd received outside official channels had included more than just flying techniques. Her mentor had taught her about military politics, The importance of documentation and strategies for surviving institutional opposition. Sarah started keeping detailed records of every discriminatory action, every biased evaluation, and every suspicious equipment failure. She documented the conversations where male pilots discussed gender-based limitations and recorded the inconsistencies between her actual performance and the official evaluations, but her most important preparation remained invisible to everyone. At Edwards Air Force Base, during weekend leave periods, Sarah continued her advanced flight training at the remote airfield, where she'd been developing capabilities that went far beyond standard military aviation curricula. Her mentor, whose identity she'd kept secret from everyone at the base, had been preparing her for exactly the kind of institutional opposition she was now facing. The training wasn't just about flying techniques or combat tactics. It was about maintaining psychological equilibrium under sustained pressure, developing tactical innovations that worked outside conventional doctrine, and preparing for scenarios where official support would be unavailable. As the weeks passed and the systematic opposition intensified, Sarah knew that the ultimate test was approaching. The increasing tensions in international airspace, the growing frequency of unidentified aircraft near American borders, and the persistent rumors about foreign military capabilities all suggested that Edwards Air Force Base would soon face a crisis that would require every available pilot. When that crisis arrived, all the evaluation reports and psychological assessments would become irrelevant. Combat situations didn't care about gender politics or institutional prejudices. They required skill, judgment, and courage under pressure, qualities that Sarah had been developing since childhood but had never been allowed to demonstrate. The systematic campaign to break her spirit and force her resignation was about to collide with international events that would reveal who was truly prepared for combat aviation. Colonel Mitchell, Captain Webb, and everyone else involved in the Vaznalzen opposition campaign were about to discover that their assumptions about fighter pilot capabilities were dangerously incomplete. The pressure was building toward an inevitable confrontation, and Sarah Chun was ready for it. The 8th month at Edwards brought a development that changed everything. International tensions had been escalating for weeks, with foreign military aircraft conducting increasingly aggressive reconnaissance missions near American territorial waters. Intelligence reports suggested that several hostile nations were coordinating their activities, testing response times, and mapping defensive capabilities along the West Coast. During the morning briefing on October 15th, Colonel Mitchell's usual routine was interrupted by secure communication from NORAD headquarters. The encrypted message was brief but ominous. All West Coast air defense installations were to maintain maximum readiness posture, with full combat alert status potentially required within 72 hours. "Gentlemen," Colonel Mitchell announced, closing the classified folder with unusual gravity, "we may be looking at our first real combat operations in the near future. Foreign aircraft have been probing our airspace with increasing frequency, and intelligence suggests they may be preparing for something more significant than routine reconnaissance." The room fell silent. Training exercises and simulations were one thing, but the possibility of actual combat operations transformed everything. Sarah watched from her position at the back of the briefing room as her colleagues absorbed the implications. These were the moments they'd all trained for, the ultimate test of everything they'd learned about aerial combat and air defense. "All pilots will maintain combat-ready status," Mitchell continued. "Aircraft will be armed and fueled for immediate deployment. Response time from alert notification to wheels up will be 12 minutes maximum." He paused, scanning the room with military precision. "Chun, you'll coordinate ground support operations during any alert conditions." The assignment hit Sarah like a physical blow. While every other pilot at Edwards prepared for potential combat operations, she would be relegated to radio communications and logistics coordination. as hostile aircraft threatened American airspace. The very scenarios she'd trained her entire life to handle. She would be watching from the operations center while others flew the missions that defined military aviation careers. That evening, Sarah received a phone call that would set in motion events none of them could have anticipated. The caller identified himself as General Patricia Hayes, Pacific Air Defense Command, speaking on a secure line that bypassed normal base communications. "Lieutenant Chun," the general's voice was crisp and professional, "I need to speak with you privately about a matter of national security importance. Tomorrow evening, 2100 hours, Hangar 7. Come alone and tell no one about this conversation." The call ended before Sarah could respond, leaving her staring at the phone with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Hangar 7 was located on the remote section of Edwards, primarily used for experimental aircraft testing and classified research projects. Why would a Pacific Air Defense Command general want to meet secretly with a grounded pilot? The next day passed with excruciating normalcy. Sarah performed her assigned duties, reviewing maintenance schedules, coordinating equipment inventories, and monitoring radio communications, while her colleagues conducted advanced combat training exercises. The irony was almost unbearable. As potential threats gathered on the horizon, the pilot with the most advanced combat training sat in an office managing paperwork that at 2100 hours precisely, Sarah approached Hangar 7. The massive building loomed against the desert night sky, its security lights casting long shadows across the empty tarmac. General Hayes was waiting inside, standing beside an aircraft that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was an F-22 Raptor, but not like any she'd seen before. The stealth fighter had been modified with advanced avionics packages, enhanced radar systems, and weapons configurations that suggested capabilities far beyond standard air superiority missions. This wasn't a training aircraft. It was a weapon system designed for combat scenarios that pushed the boundaries of current military aviation. "Lieutenant Chun," General Hayes stepped forward, her expression serious. "What I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that don't officially exist. Your presence here tonight is not recorded in any database, and this conversation never happened." Sarah nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. 3 days ago, our intelligence services intercepted communications suggesting a coordinated strike against multiple West Coast targets. 15 advanced fighter aircraft, origin unknown but consistent with several hostile nations' latest technology, are preparing for an infiltration mission that could cripple our air defense capabilities. The general paused, studying Sarah's reaction. "The attack is designed to exploit a specific vulnerability in our current defensive posture. Our standard intercept protocols assume enemy aircraft will follow predictable flight patterns and engage according to conventional tactical doctrine. These aircraft appear to be equipped with countermeasures that will neutralize our normal response capabilities." Sarah found her voice. "What does this have to do with me, General? I'm currently grounded from combat operations." General Hayes smiled grimly. "Your grounding status is exactly why you're here. For the past 8 months, Colonel Mitchell has been filing reports characterizing you as unsuitable for combat aviation. Those reports have been forwarded to my office as part of routine personnel evaluations." The general walked closer to the modified F-22. "What Colonel Mitchell doesn't know is that I've been monitoring your actual performance data, not his interpreted evaluations. Your simulation scores, tactical innovations, and aircraft handling capabilities suggest training far beyond standard Air Force Academy curricula." Sarah's heart began racing as she realized where this conversation was heading. More importantly, General Hayes continued, "Our investigation into your background revealed some interesting family connections. Your father's military service included classified assignments that weren't reflected in his official personnel file. After his death, Those files were declassified and forwarded to my office. The general opened a sealed folder and extracted documents that Sarah had never seen before. Flight logs from her father's military service, commendation reports, and training records that painted a completely different picture of his aviation background. Staff Sergeant Michael Chun was part of an experimental program called Project Shadowhawk, developing unconventional aerial combat techniques for scenarios that conventional pilots couldn't handle. His training included tactics that were considered too dangerous for standard military aviation. Sarah stared at the documents, recognizing her father's handwriting in mission reports and tactical analyses that described combat maneuvers she'd practiced during those weekend training sessions at the remote airfield. The interesting thing about Project Shadowhawk, General Hayes continued, is that it didn't end when your father left military service. The program evolved, moved into private training facilities, and continued developing pilots with capabilities that exceed anything currently taught in official military curricula. The revelation hit Sarah like physical force. The weekend training sessions, the advanced combat techniques, the mysterious mentor who'd insisted on secrecy. It had all been connected to her father's classified military background. I believe you've been receiving advanced training through Shadowhawk's civilian continuation program, General Hayes said directly. I believe your capabilities exceed those of any pilot currently stationed at Edwards Air Force Base, and I believe you may be the only pilot we have who can handle what's coming. Sarah's mind reeled as the implications became clear. The systematic opposition she'd faced, the efforts to ground her and force her resignation, had been inadvertently protecting her from exposure while she developed capabilities that went far beyond standard military aviation training. The 15 aircraft approaching our airspace aren't planning a conventional attack, General Hayes explained. They're using tactics that will neutralize our normal intercept procedures, electronic warfare capabilities that will blind our radar, systems, countermeasures that will defeat our standard missile systems, and flight patterns that exploit gaps in our defensive coverage. The general gestured toward the modified F-22. This aircraft has been equipped to counter those advantages, but it requires a pilot who can think and react beyond conventional tactical doctrine. Someone who's been trained to handle scenarios that don't exist in our standard operating procedures. Sarah looked at the stealth fighter, understanding finally why she'd been brought here. You want me to intercept them? I want you to stop them, General Hayes corrected. Our standard defensive protocols will fail against these aircraft. Our best pilots will be engaging targets using tactics that won't work against this level of opposition. But someone with unconventional training, someone who's been prepared for scenarios beyond normal military aviation, might be able to turn their own advantages against them. The weight of the revelation settled over Sarah like a physical presence. Everything she'd endured at Edwards, the discrimination, the systematic opposition, the efforts to break her spirit, had been preparing her for this moment without anyone realizing it. There's one more thing, General Hayes added, her voice dropping to a whisper. The intelligence about these 15 aircraft came from sources that suggest they know about Edwards Air Force Base's personnel roster. They know which pilots are stationed here, what their capabilities are, and how our standard defensive procedures operate. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. They're not just attacking randomly. They're planning to exploit specific weaknesses. In our response, exactly. But they don't know about you, because officially you don't exist as a combat-capable pilot. Colonel Mitchell's efforts to ground you may have inadvertently created the perfect element of surprise. The general handed Sarah a flight helmet designed specifically for the modified F-22. The decision is yours, Lieutenant. You can return to your quarters and maintain your current status, or you can prepare for a mission that will determine whether 15 enemy aircraft succeed in crippling our West Coast air defenses. Sarah took the helmet, feeling its weight and understanding that accepting it meant stepping into a reality that would change everything she thought she knew about her military career. When? She asked. Intelligence suggests they'll make their move within 48 hours. Probably during a shift change when our defensive posture is temporarily reduced. General Hayes moved toward the hangar exit. If you accept this mission, your training begins tomorrow night. Same time, same location. Tell no one. As the general disappeared into the darkness, Sarah stood alone in the hangar with the modified F-22 and the growing realization that her entire life had been leading to this moment. The systematic opposition at Edwards, her father's hidden military background, and the mysterious advanced training she'd been receiving. It had all been preparation for a confrontation that would test capabilities no one knew she possessed. Tomorrow night, she would begin training for a mission that would either vindicate everything she'd endured or prove that even the most advanced preparation couldn't overcome overwhelming odds. But first, she had to survive one more day of pretending to be the grounded pilot that everyone at Edwards believed her to be. While preparing for combat operations that would redefine aerial warfare, the alert came at 0347 hours on October 18th. Exactly as General Hayes had predicted. Sarah was already awake, dressed, and waiting in her quarters when the base-wide klaxon began its piercing wail. 2 nights of intensive training in the modified F-22 had prepared her for this moment, but nothing could have prepared Edwards Air Force Base for what was about to unfold. In the operations center, radar operators watched in disbelief as 15 aircraft materialized on their screens, flying in perfect formation at an altitude and speed that seemed impossible for conventional fighters. The bogies had appeared suddenly, as if emerging from electronic invisibility, and were advancing toward the California coast at Mach 2.3. Colonel Mitchell burst into the operations center, his uniform hastily assembled and his expression showing the first cracks in his usual military composure. "Report," he barked at the duty officer. "Sir, 15 unidentified aircraft bearing 270 degrees. Altitude 45,000 feet, speed Mach 2.3 and climbing." The radar operator responded, his voice tight with tension. "They appeared suddenly on our screens. Approximately 3 minutes ago. No response to radio communications, no transponder signals." Mitchell studied the tactical display, his mind racing through defensive protocols that suddenly seemed inadequate. "Scramble all available aircraft. Full combat load. Vector intercept course 290 degrees. The base erupted into controlled chaos as pilots sprinted toward their aircraft. Within minutes, 8 F-22 Raptors were thundering down the runway, their afterburners painting streaks of blue flame against the pre-dawn darkness. Captain Webb led the formation, with Lieutenant Morrison as his wingman, followed by 6 other pilots representing the best of Edwards Air Force Base. Sarah watched from the operations center, officially assigned to coordinate ground support communications, while others flew the most important intercept mission in decades. But hidden beneath her regulation headset was a microtransmitter that connected her directly to General Hayes' classified command frequency. "Shadow 1, this is Control," came the general's voice through the hidden earpiece. "Package is airborne. Your window opens in 12 minutes. Sarah nodded slightly, maintaining her cover while monitoring the standard tactical communications as the intercept formation climbed toward their targets. What she heard over the next few minutes would change everything about modern aerial combat. "Contact." Webb's voice crackled over the radio. "Visual on multiple bogies, 40,000 feet, maintaining formation. They're not responding to warning calls. Alpha Leader, you are cleared to engage if targets show hostile intent," came the response from Edwards' control tower. What happened next defied every assumption about air-to-air combat. As Webb's formation approached within missile range, the enemy aircraft executed maneuvers that seemed to violate the laws of physics. They scattered in multiple directions simultaneously, pulling G-forces that should have been impossible for human pilots. while deploying electronic countermeasures that rendered the F-22's advanced radar systems virtually useless. "Control, we've lost radar lock on all targets." Morrison's voice carried the first note of panic. "They're jamming everything. I can't get a firing solution." "Alpha Flight, maintain visual contact and engage with cannon systems," Webb ordered, but his formation was already disintegrating. The enemy aircraft were moving with precision and speed that made conventional intercept tactics useless. Sarah listened to the radio chatter with growing understanding. These weren't conventional enemy pilots. They were something else entirely. The flight patterns, the impossible maneuvers, the coordinated electronic warfare capabilities all pointed to technology that exceeded current American military capabilities by a significant margin. "Shadow 1, enemy formation is splitting into 3 groups." General Hayes' voice updated through the concealed earpiece. "Primary group continuing toward Los Angeles, secondary group vectoring toward San Francisco, tertiary group engaging our intercept flight. You are cleared for immediate launch." Sarah stood up from her console and walked calmly toward the exit, her movements drawing no attention from the operations staff, who were frantically coordinating the failing intercept mission. Colonel Mitchell was too focused on the tactical display to notice her departure. Hangar 7 was pitch dark when Sarah arrived, but the modified F-22 was ready. Ground crew members wearing no identification badges worked with silent efficiency, performing final systems checks on an aircraft that officially didn't exist. The stealth fighter had been equipped with experimental weapon systems, advanced countermeasure packages, and avionics that represented technology years ahead of standard military hardware. "All systems green," reported the anonymous crew chief, as Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection. "Electronic warfare suite is online. Experimental missiles are armed and ready, and the aircraft stealth configuration has been optimized for tonight's specific threats." Sarah climbed into the cockpit, feeling the familiar weight of the flight helmet and the subtle vibration of advanced systems coming online. But this time was different. The months of weekend training, the years of preparation that she'd never fully understood, and the systematic opposition that had inadvertently kept her hidden. Everything was converging into this single moment. "Shadow 1, you are cleared for immediate takeoff." General Hayes' voice came through the secure communication system. "Primary targets are the group heading toward Los Angeles. Secondary priority is the San Francisco group. The engagement over Edwards is being handled by our standard forces." Sarah taxied toward a runway that wasn't shown on any official base maps, located on the far side of Edwards, where experimental aircraft conducted classified test flights. As the F-22's engines spooled up to full power, she could hear the continuing radio chatter from the conventional intercept mission. "Alpha Leader, we've lost 3 aircraft." Morrison's voice was now openly panicked. "These things are moving like nothing I've ever seen. Request immediate backup. All available units vector." "To support Alpha Flight," Colonel Mitchell's voice responded, but Sarah knew it was too late. Conventional tactics weren't going to work against these opponents. The modified F-22 lifted off into the darkness, its advanced stealth systems rendering it invisible to both enemy and friendly radar. Sarah climbed rapidly toward 50,000 feet, using flight techniques that she'd learned during those mysterious weekend training sessions but had never fully understood until now. At altitude, her enhanced radar systems painted a tactical picture that revealed the true scope of the threat. The 15 enemy aircraft weren't just advanced fighters. They were operating with coordination and precision that suggested either artificial intelligence or pilot training that exceeded anything in current military doctrine. "Shadow 1, you have visual contact with the primary group," Sarah reported as her scope identified the 5 aircraft heading toward Los Angeles, attempting to intercept. What followed was unlike any aerial combat in military history. The enemy aircraft detected her approach despite her stealth configuration and immediately executed evasive maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of aerodynamic possibility. But Sarah had been trained for exactly this scenario. Instead of following conventional intercept procedures, she employed tactics that her weekend instructor had drilled into her for years. Approach vectors that exploited blind spots in advanced radar systems, weapons employment techniques that accounted for electronic countermeasures, and flight patterns that turned the enemy's superior technology against itself. Her first shot came from an angle that conventional military doctrine said was impossible, banking the F-22 into a vertical climb, while inverting the aircraft and firing through a narrow window when the enemy's countermeasures were briefly ineffective. The experimental missile found its target, and the first enemy aircraft disintegrated in a ball of flame at 48,000 feet. Shadow 1, confirmed kill on primary target, Sarah reported, but she was already engaging the second aircraft. The enemy formation scattered, but Sarah had anticipated their evasive patterns. Years of training in unconventional aerial combat tactics allowed her to predict movements that would have confused conventional pilots. She positioned herself for shots that exploited momentary vulnerabilities in their defensive systems. The second kill came during a high-speed pursuit that pushed both aircraft beyond their design limitations. Sarah's opponent tried to escape by diving toward the ground at near vertical angles, pulling out of the dive at the last possible moment. But Sarah had been taught to handle exactly this scenario. During training sessions that had seemed impossibly dangerous at the time, she followed the enemy aircraft through the dive, maintaining firing position while pulling G-forces that would have incapacitated most pilots. At 2,000 feet above the ground, she fired again. The second enemy aircraft crashed into the Mojave Desert in a fireball visible for miles. "Control. This is impossible," came Webb's voice over the radio. "Unknown Friendly is engaging primary group with success. Who's flying that aircraft?" Sarah was already turning toward the second group of enemy aircraft, the ones vectoring toward San Francisco. Her modified F-22 climbed back to altitude while her enhanced radar systems tracked multiple targets across hundreds of miles of airspace. But what she discovered changed everything she thought she knew about the threat. The remaining enemy aircraft weren't just employing advanced technology. They were coordinating with ground-based systems that painted a picture of a much larger operation than anyone had realized. "General, I'm reading multiple ground installations supporting enemy operations," Sarah reported through the secure channel. "This isn't just an air attack. It's a coordinated assault on our entire West Coast defense infrastructure." "Understood." Shadow 1. Eliminate all airborne threats. Ground installations are being handled by other assets. The next 30 minutes redefined aerial combat for the modern era. Sarah engaged multiple targets simultaneously, using tactics that seemed to violate established physics while employing weapon systems that hadn't existed in conventional military inventories. Each engagement pushed her skills and aircraft to the absolute limits, but the years of mysterious training had prepared her for exactly these impossible scenarios. By 045 hours, 13 of the 15 enemy aircraft had been eliminated. The remaining 2 had fled beyond radar range, apparently deciding that continuing the mission was no longer viable. As Sarah turned her F-22 back toward Edwards Air Force Base, she realized that everything had changed. Not just for her military career, but for everyone who had witnessed what had just occurred. The radio chatter from the operations center reflected the shock and confusion of officers trying to process events that defied their understanding of aerial combat. "Control, requesting identity of the unknown friendly aircraft." Webb's voice came through the radio, his tone showing exhaustion and bewilderment. "Alpha Leader, return to base for debriefing. Unknown Friendly's identity is classified." But Sarah knew that maintaining secrecy would be impossible. Too many people had witnessed her performance, and the tactical recordings would raise questions that couldn't be answered with standard explanations. The systematic opposition that had tried to ground her was about to collide with evidence of capabilities that exceeded anything in the FIDE official military inventory. As she approached Edwards for landing, Sarah could see the base in full alert status. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, senior officers waited in the operations center, and every available pilot was being debriefed about an engagement that would require them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about modern aerial warfare. The modified F-22 touched down on the hidden runway, and Sarah taxied back to Hangar 7 where General Hayes was waiting. But she could already see vehicles approaching from the main base, led by Colonel Mitchell's staff car. The secret was about to become very public, and Lieutenant Sarah Chun was about to discover that proving her capabilities was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. The convoy of vehicles approaching Hangar 7 included every senior officer stationed at Edwards Air Force Base. Colonel Mitchell led the procession, followed by the base's intelligence chief, operations commander, and a collection of pilots who had witnessed aerial combat that redefined their understanding of what was possible in military aviation. General Hayes stood beside the modified F-22 as Sarah completed her post-flight procedures, her expression revealing nothing about the storm that was about to break. The hangar's massive doors had been sealed, but the security measures couldn't contain what had just occurred over the skies of California. General Hayes. Colonel Mitchell's voice carried a mixture of authority and confusion as he entered the secured hangar. I need immediate explanations about tonight's operations. My pilots report engaging an unknown friendly aircraft that demonstrated capabilities that exceed anything in our current inventory. Sarah removed her helmet and turned to face the assembled officers. The flight suit she wore bore no standard identification markings, but her face was unmistakable to every person present. The collective intake of breath from the gathered pilots created an almost audible moment of recognition. Lieutenant Chun? Captain Webb stepped forward, his voice showing the disbelief of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. You flew that aircraft? Before Sarah could respond, General Hayes stepped between them. What you witnessed tonight is classified under national security protocols that supersede all standard military procedures. However, given the circumstances and the number of personnel involved, a limited briefing is authorized. The general gestured toward a secure conference area within the hangar, where chairs had been arranged around a table equipped with classified communication systems. What I'm about to reveal has been classified for 27 years, but recent events have made disclosure necessary. As the officers took their seats, Sarah noticed the mixture of expressions around the table. Webb showed obvious shock at discovering that the pilot he'd spent months trying to discredit had just saved the West Coast from aerial attack. Morrison appeared confused and slightly fearful, as if realizing that everything he thought he knew about aviation had been wrong. Colonel Mitchell's face revealed the growing understanding that his evaluation of Sarah's capabilities had been catastrophically incorrect. In 1997, General Hayes began. The United States Air Force initiated a CLASSIFIED research program called Project Shadowhawk. The program's objective was to develop aerial combat techniques that could counter threats beyond the capabilities of conventional military aviation. She activated a secure display system that showed declassified documents, flight test records, and personnel files that had never been seen outside classified channels. Project Shadowhawk recruited pilots with exceptional natural abilities and subjected them to training regimens that pushed the boundaries of human performance and aircraft capabilities. The first document displayed showed Sarah's father, Staff Sergeant Michael Chun, in military dress uniform alongside 11 other pilots. The photograph was dated 1998 and the accompanying text described training exercises that sounded more like science fiction than military aviation. Staff Sergeant Chun was one of the program's most successful participants, General Hayes continued. He developed techniques for high-G maneuvering that allowed conventional aircraft to outperform technically superior opponents. His innovations in electronic warfare countermeasures and unconventional attack vectors became the foundation for advanced pilot training programs that continue today. Captain Webb leaned forward, studying the documents with growing amazement. These maneuvers would be impossible for normal pilots. The G-forces alone would cause unconsciousness or death. Correct, General Hayes replied. Which is why Project Shadowhawk developed specialized training protocols that enhanced human tolerance for extreme flight conditions. Conditioning techniques that improved spatial awareness, reaction time, and physical endurance beyond normal human parameters. She turned to another document that showed training facilities located in remote areas across the American West, small airfields with no official designation, equipped with aircraft that had been modified for capabilities that exceeded standard military specifications. When Project Shadowhawk was officially terminated in 2003, the training infrastructure was transferred to civilian contractors who continued developing pilot capabilities outside official military channels. Staff Sergeant Chun became one of the program's civilian instructors after his military service ended. Sarah felt the weight of every gaze in the room as the implications became clear. The weekend training sessions that had shaped her entire approach to aviation weren't casual father-daughter activities. They were continuation of the most advanced pilot development program in American military history. Lieutenant Chun has been receiving Shadowhawk training since childhood, General Hayes revealed. Her capabilities exceed those of any pilot currently in active military service because she's been prepared for scenarios that our standard training doesn't address. Colonel Mitchell's face had gone pale as he processed the revelation. You're saying that I've been evaluating a pilot with classified training that I didn't know existed? You've been evaluating a pilot whose true capabilities were deliberately concealed, General Hayes corrected. The discrimination and systematic opposition that Lieutenant Chun faced at Edwards Air Force Base inadvertently provided perfect cover for maintaining operational security around her background. The room fell silent as the assembled officers absorbed what they were hearing. Everything they thought they knew about Sarah's performance, her suitability for combat operations, and her place in the military aviation hierarchy had been based on incomplete information. Lieutenant Morrison found his voice first. The evaluation reports, the psychological assessments, the equipment failures, were those all fabricated? The evaluation reports were based on scenarios designed to assess conventional pilot capabilities. General Hayes explained. Lieutenant Chun was performing at levels that exceeded the parameters of standard military assessment tools. Her responses were interpreted as problematic because they demonstrated capabilities that weren't supposed to exist. She turned to another display, showing Sarah's actual performance data compared to established baselines for military aviation. The numbers revealed skills in reaction time, spatial reasoning, and tactical analysis that were literally off the charts used for standard pilot evaluation. The psychological assessments flagged personality traits that are considered problematic for conventional military aviation but are essential for Shadowhawk-level operations. Independence of thought, willingness to challenge established procedures, and ability to function effectively under extreme isolation are all characteristics that the program specifically develops. Captain Webb spoke slowly, as if working through a complex puzzle. The equipment failures, the maintenance issues that seemed to follow her assignments, were legitimate responses to stress levels that would have destroyed standard military aircraft, General Hayes replied. Lieutenant Chun's training includes techniques that push aircraft beyond their designed operational limits. Standard maintenance protocols didn't account for the additional stress her flying style placed on conventional systems. The revelation transformed everything the assembled officers thought they understood about the past 8 months. Sarah's exclusion from prime flying assignments hadn't been based on legitimate performance concerns. It had been the result of evaluation systems that couldn't accurately assess capabilities they weren't designed to measure. "There's more," General Hayes continued, turning to classified documents that showed the full scope of the Shadowhawk program. The 15 aircraft that attacked tonight weren't using conventional technology. Intelligence analysis suggests they were piloted by individuals with training similar to Project Shadowhawk, but developed by hostile nations who've been working to counter American air superiority. The tactical implications hit everyone simultaneously. The United States wasn't just facing advanced enemy aircraft, they were facing pilots who had been trained to defeat conventional American aerial combat doctrine. Lieutenant Chun's performance tonight demonstrated that Shadowhawk techniques can counter these advanced threats, General Hayes explained. 13 confirmed eliminations against targets that defeated our standard intercept procedures. No damage to her aircraft, no assistance required, and tactical innovation that turned enemy advantages into vulnerabilities. Sarah finally spoke, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had just proven capabilities that others had spent months trying to disprove. "The training I received prepared me for exactly the scenarios we faced tonight. Unconventional attack vectors, electronic warfare environments, and opponents with capabilities that exceed standard threat assessments." She looked around the table at the officers who had systematically excluded her from flying opportunities. Every weekend training session included scenarios where conventional tactics would fail, where success required thinking beyond established doctrine and employing techniques that aren't taught in standard military curricula. Colonel Mitchell's expression showed the beginning of understanding about the magnitude of his misjudgment. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. The evaluation methods we used were inadequate for assessing your actual capabilities." The evaluation methods were designed for conventional pilots, Sarah replied without bitterness. "My background required assessment criteria that don't exist in standard military protocols." General Hayes stood and moved to a final display that showed current intelligence about international threats to American airspace. "What happened tonight is just the beginning. Multiple hostile nations are developing advanced pilot training programs based on stolen Shadowhawk techniques. The 15 aircraft we encountered were a test of our defensive capabilities." The display showed projected threat assessments that painted a sobering picture of future aerial combat requirements. Advanced enemy aircraft with capabilities that exceeded current American technology, piloted by individuals trained to exploit weaknesses in conventional defensive tactics. "The United States Air Force needs to expand the Shadowhawk program immediately," General Hayes announced. "We need pilots who can counter these advanced threats, and we need training facilities that can develop capabilities beyond current military aviation standards." She turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed respect and determination. "Lieutenant Chun, you've just demonstrated that the program works. The question now is whether you're willing to help build the next generation of American air superiority." The room waited as Sarah considered the implications. Everything she had endured at Edwards, the discrimination, the systematic opposition, the efforts to force her resignation, had been preparing her for this moment without anyone realizing it. "I accept," Sarah said simply, "but I have conditions." "General." Hayes nodded. "We expected you would. First, the pilots who demonstrated courage tonight, even when facing impossible odds, deserve consideration for advanced training. Captain Webb and Lieutenant Morrison showed they're willing to engage superior threats when American airspace is threatened." Webb looked up with surprise and gratitude. After months of opposing her presence at Edwards, Sarah was recommending him for the most advanced pilot training program in American military history. Second, the evaluation and training systems that created tonight's problems need to be completely restructured. No pilot should face systematic opposition based on inadequate assessment methods. Agreed, General Hayes replied. Third, this program needs to prioritize developing pilots who can think beyond conventional doctrine, regardless of their background or demographics. Colonel Mitchell nodded slowly, understanding that Sarah was diplomatically requiring the elimination of the prejudices that had nearly prevented her from being available when the crisis occurred. As the meeting concluded and the assembled officers began to grasp the full implications of what they had witnessed, Sarah realized that proving her capabilities had been only the first step in a much larger transformation of American military aviation. 6 weeks after the aerial engagement that redefined American air defense, Lieutenant Sarah Chun stood before a classified assembly that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. The secure conference facility at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada hosted representatives from every branch of the military, intelligence agencies whose names weren't spoken publicly, and foreign allies whose own air forces had encountered similar advanced threats. The transformation had been swift and decisive. Within 72 hours of the Edwards incident, Sarah had been promoted to captain and assigned to lead the reconstituted Project Shadowhawk. The program's new mandate was ambitious beyond anything attempted in modern military aviation: develop pilot capabilities that could counter threats operating beyond conventional tactical doctrine. Ladies and gentlemen, General Hayes addressed the assembled group. 6 weeks ago, 15 advanced aircraft penetrated American airspace using technology and tactics that rendered our standard defensive procedures obsolete. Captain Chun eliminated 13 of those threats using techniques that most of our pilots didn't know existed. The room contained some of the most experienced military aviation professionals in the world, but Sarah could see the mixture of curiosity and skepticism in their expressions. The idea that a single pilot could outperform entire squadrons of elite fighters challenged fundamental assumptions about aerial combat. Intelligence analysis of the engagement reveals tactics and capabilities that suggest multiple hostile nations have been developing advanced pilot training programs specifically designed to counter American air superiority. General Hayes continued. The threat we faced was not an isolated incident, but a preview of future aerial combat requirements. Sarah stepped forward to address the assembly, wearing the uniform of her new rank but carrying the weight of knowledge that most military professionals would find difficult to accept. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of classified briefings, congressional testimony, and strategic planning sessions that outlined the scope of what they were attempting to build. The Project Shadowhawk training protocols push human performance beyond current military aviation standards, Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven her capabilities under impossible conditions. The techniques involve enhanced G-force tolerance, accelerated decision-making under extreme stress, and tactical innovation that exploits conventional doctrine's limitations. She activated a secure presentation system that displayed training footage from the revived Shadowhawk program. The video showed pilots executing maneuvers that seemed to violate physics, aircraft being pushed beyond their design specifications, and combat scenarios that resembled science fiction more than military aviation. Traditional pilot training assumes that human limitations define aircraft performance boundaries, Sarah explained. Shadowhawk training reverses that assumption. We develop human capabilities to match theoretical aircraft performance, then modify aircraft systems to exceed their original design parameters. Captain Webb, who had volunteered for the program after witnessing Sarah's performance, raised his hand. Captain Chun, the physical demands you're describing would incapacitate most pilots. How do you prepare human beings for stress levels that exceed normal tolerance? Sarah smiled slightly, remembering the skepticism she'd faced before proving Her capabilities in combat. The conditioning program begins with psychological preparation that teaches pilots to function effectively under isolation and sustained pressure. Physical training that gradually increases G-force tolerance beyond standard limits. And tactical education that emphasizes innovation over established procedures. She turned to another display showing the program's current roster. We've identified 47 pilots from various services who demonstrate the baseline capabilities required for advanced training. The selection criteria prioritize adaptive thinking, tolerance for unconventional approaches, and demonstrated performance under extreme stress. Among the selected pilots were several surprising choices that reflected Sarah's commitment to identifying talent regardless of traditional qualifications. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez from the Navy's test pilot program, who had been passed over for elite assignments due to concerns about her unconventional approach to aircraft testing. Major David Kim from the Marines, whose tactical innovations had been criticized as too risky for standard operations. Captain Jennifer Walsh from the Air Force, whose simulation scores exceeded established records, but whose independent nature had generated negative evaluation reports. The program faces significant challenges beyond technical and physical requirements. Sarah continued, addressing the elephant in the room that everyone was thinking about but hesitant to discuss. Institutional resistance to capabilities that operate outside established doctrine. Evaluation systems that aren't designed to assess unconventional performance. And command structures that prioritize conformity over innovation. General Hayes stepped forward to address the institutional concerns directly. The Department of Defense has authorized complete autonomy for Project Shadowhawk operations. Captain Chun's unit will report directly to Pacific Command, bypassing traditional command hierarchies that might constrain program development. The announcement sent murmurs through the assembly. Military organizations were built on hierarchical structures and standardized procedures, granting operational autonomy to a program that explicitly rejected conventional approaches represented a fundamental shift in defense strategy. The training facilities are being established at 3 classified locations across the American West, Sarah announced, displaying maps that showed remote installations with no official designation. Each facility will specialize in different aspects of advanced pilot development. High-G conditioning at the Colorado site, electronic warfare training in Nevada, and tactical innovation exercises in Montana. She paused, recognizing the magnitude of what they were attempting to build. The timeline is aggressive. International intelligence suggests that hostile nations are accelerating their own advanced pilot programs. We have approximately 18 months to develop capabilities that can counter threats that currently exceed our defensive capacity. Colonel Angela Martinez, representing the Pentagon Strategic Planning Division, asked the question that concerns senior leadership most. Captain, what's your assessment of success probability? Are we investing massive resources in a program that might not produce measurable results? Sarah's response reflected the confidence of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for exactly this moment. Colonel, 6 weeks ago, 15 advanced aircraft penetrated American airspace and defeated our best intercept procedures. Using Shadowhawk techniques, I eliminated 13 of those threats without assistance and without sustaining damage. The program works because I am living proof that it works. The room fell silent as the assembled professionals absorbed the implications. Sarah wasn't just proposing theoretical capabilities, she was demonstrating them. The question isn't whether we can develop these abilities, Sarah continued. The question is whether we can scale the training to produce enough advanced pilots to counter the threats that are developing worldwide. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself navigating challenges that went far beyond technical aviation. Training. Building a program that operated outside conventional military structures required diplomatic skills, strategic thinking, and leadership capabilities that she'd never been taught. but somehow possessed naturally. The first major challenge came from within the military establishment itself. Senior officers who had spent decades building careers around conventional doctrine were reluctant to embrace approaches that made their expertise obsolete. Sarah faced resistance that was more sophisticated than the discrimination she'd encountered at Edwards. This opposition came from people who understood the implications of what she was building and feared the changes it would bring to military aviation. General Robert Harrison, who commanded Air Combat Command, requested a private meeting that revealed the scope of institutional concern about Project Shadowhawk. "Captain Chun," he began, his tone respectful but concerned, "I've reviewed the program documentation and spoken with pilots who've witnessed your capabilities. I'm not questioning your abilities or the program's potential." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "My concern is about the broader implications. If we develop pilots with capabilities that exceed current aircraft limitations, we'll need to redesign our entire fleet. If we train pilots to operate outside established doctrine, we'll need to rewrite our tactical manuals. The cost and complexity of these changes could destabilize our current air superiority advantage." Sarah understood the general's concerns, but also recognized the fundamental flaw in his reasoning. "General, with respect, our current air superiority advantage is already compromised. The 15 aircraft that penetrated our airspace 6 weeks ago proved that conventional doctrine isn't adequate for modern threats." She pulled up classified intelligence reports on her secure tablet. These documents show at least 6 hostile nations developing advanced pilot capabilities specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in American defensive tactics. Whether we adapt or not, they're preparing to counter our current advantages. The general studied intelligence with growing concern. "You're saying we're in an arms race involving pilot capabilities rather than aircraft technology?" "I'm saying the arms race already started, and we were losing because we didn't know we were competing," Sarah replied. "Project Shadowhawk gives us the opportunity to regain the initiative, but only if we're willing to accept that aviation warfare is evolving beyond current paradigms." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from budget implications to strategic doctrine changes that would ripple through the entire military establishment. By its conclusion, General Harrison had become an advocate for the program rather than an obstacle. The second major challenge involved international cooperation. Several allied nations had experienced similar aerial incursions and were developing their own responses to advanced threat capabilities. Coordinating multiple national programs while maintaining operational security required diplomatic skills that Sarah had never anticipated needing. The breakthrough came during a classified meeting with Colonel James Thompson, representing the United Kingdom's Royal Air Force. "Captain Chun," he began with typical British understatement, "we've had some rather interesting encounters over the North Sea that suggest our American cousins aren't the only ones facing advanced aerial threats." The intelligence Thompson shared painted a picture of coordinated international efforts to develop pilot capabilities that could overwhelm NATO air defenses. British, French, and German forces had all encountered aircraft demonstrating capabilities similar to what Sarah had faced over California. "We'd like to propose joint training exercises," Thompson continued, "sharing techniques and developing cooperative responses to threats that obviously don't respect national boundaries." The proposal led to the establishment of an international advanced pilot training consortium that would become one of Sarah's most significant achievements. Within months, pilots from 6 allied nations were training together at Shadowhawk facilities, developing capabilities that would redefine international air defense cooperation. But the most significant challenge Sarah faced wasn't technical or diplomatic, it was personal. Leading a program that pushed the boundaries of human performance while maintaining the psychological equilibrium necessary for effective command required inner strength that she'd never been forced to develop. The pilots entering Shadowhawk training were exceptional individuals who had volunteered for a program that would test their limits in ways that standard military service never approached. Some would succeed beyond their wildest expectations. Others would discover that their limitations were more restrictive than they believed. Sarah found herself responsible not just for developing unprecedented capabilities, but for supporting individuals through transformations that redefined their understanding of what was possible in military aviation. The role required empathy, judgment, and leadership skills that she'd learned through adversity rather than formal instruction. As the program gained momentum and began producing pilots with capabilities that amazed even Sarah herself, she realized that everything she'd endured at Edwards Air Force Base had been preparation for responsibilities that extended far beyond personal vindication. She was building the future of American air superiority, one exceptional pilot at a time. 18 months after the night that changed everything, Colonel Sarah Chun stood on the observation deck of the most advanced pilot training facility ever constructed. The Nevada mountains stretched endlessly beyond the reinforced glass, their peaks catching the morning sun as six modified F-35 Lightning II aircraft executed maneuvers that would have been impossible before. Project Shadowhawk redefined the boundaries of human aviation capability. The transformation had exceeded even Sarah's most optimistic projections. What began as an emergency response to a single aerial threat had evolved into a comprehensive revolution in military aviation doctrine, international defense cooperation, and human performance development that influenced far more than combat. Flying. Below her, Captain Jennifer Walsh led a formation of Shadowhawk graduates through exercises that demonstrated capabilities no military planners had imagined 2 years earlier. The pilots were pulling sustained G-forces that exceeded previous human tolerance limits, while maintaining tactical awareness and decision-making precision that redefined what was possible in aerial combat. Formation Alpha. Initiate maneuver. Set 7. Walsh's voice came through the observation deck's communication system. Demonstrate coordinated electronic warfare countermeasures with simultaneous multi-target engagement. Sarah watched as the 6 aircraft scattered across the training airspace, each pilot employing techniques that turned conventional defensive tactics into offensive advantages. Electronic jamming systems that would have blinded standard fighters became navigation aids for Shadowhawk pilots who had learned to exploit electromagnetic interference patterns. G-forces that would have incapacitated normal aircrew became tactical advantages that allowed impossible approach vectors and evasive maneuvers. Incredible, murmured General Patricia Hayes, who had joined Sarah for the monthly program review. 18 months ago, we had 1 pilot with these capabilities. Now we're graduating 12 new Shadowhawk pilots every 6 weeks. The numbers told a story of success that had surprised even the program's strongest supporters. 147 pilots had completed advanced training across the 3 specialized facilities. International exchange programs had produced 38 allied pilots with Shadowhawk capabilities. Most importantly, real-world intercept missions had demonstrated that the training translated into operational effectiveness that exceeded all theoretical projections. The international impact has been even more significant than domestic results, Sarah replied, reviewing classified reports on her secure tablet. The cooperative training programs have created the first truly integrated air defense network among allied nations. When threats appear now, we have pilots from 6 different countries who can coordinate responses using compatible tactics and communication protocols. The diplomatic breakthrough had been unexpected but revolutionary. Traditional military cooperation between allied nations involved extensive negotiation about procedures, equipment compatibility, and command authority. Shadowhawk pilots trained together from the beginning, developing personal relationships and tactical understanding that transcended national boundaries. 3 weeks earlier, when advanced hostile aircraft had attempted to penetrate European airspace. The response had demonstrated the program's strategic value. American Shadowhawk pilots stationed in Germany had coordinated seamlessly with British and French pilots to eliminate the threat before conventional forces could even achieve radar contact. The engagement lasted 14 minutes and resulted in complete neutralization of enemy capabilities without a single friendly aircraft sustaining damage. The congressional testimony last month generated some interesting discussions about program expansion. General Hayes continued, accessing her own classified files. Senator Richardson's committee is recommending that Shadowhawk techniques be integrated into standard pilot training curricula across all services. Sarah nodded, but her expression showed the complexity of scaling capabilities that had been developed for exceptional individuals. Integration will require fundamental changes in aircraft design, training facilities, and evaluation procedures. We're talking about rebuilding military aviation from the ground up. The challenge wasn't just technical but cultural. Shadowhawk training produced pilots who thought differently about aviation, tactics, and military hierarchy. They questioned established procedures not from insubordination, but from understanding that innovation often required abandoning conventional wisdom. Managing these exceptional individuals within traditional military structures had required developing entirely new leadership approaches. There's another development that might interest you, General Hayes said, turning to a different section of her briefing materials. The civilian aviation industry has been quietly approaching the Pentagon about Shadowhawk techniques for commercial applications. The inquiry reflected an unexpected consequence of the program's success. Enhanced human performance training, improved G-force tolerance, and advanced decision-making under pressure had applications beyond military aviation. Commercial test pilots, emergency medical helicopter crews, and aerospace research programs had all expressed interest in modified training protocols. Boeing's experimental division believes that Shadowhawk techniques could enable civilian pilots to safely operate aircraft with performance characteristics that currently exceed human operational limits. General Hayes explained, they're proposing joint research programs that could revolutionize commercial aviation within a decade. Sarah considered the implications. Project Shadowhawk had begun as a desperate response to immediate military threats, but it was evolving into something much larger. The techniques developed for counterattacking advanced enemy aircraft were applicable to any situation requiring human performance beyond normal limitations. We'll need to be careful about technology transfer and operational security, Sarah replied. But if these techniques can improve safety and capability in civilian aviation, we have an obligation to explore the possibilities. The conversation was interrupted by an alert tone from the facility's secure communication system. Sarah recognized the priority level immediately. This was notification of an active threat requiring Shadowhawk response. Colonel Chun, the duty officer's voice came through the encrypted channel. We have 15 unidentified aircraft approaching the Pacific coast at high speed. Conventional intercept flights have been scrambled, but intelligence suggests this may be similar to the previous advanced threat. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded complex aerial operations, but this time was different. Instead of facing the threat alone with experimental equipment and untested procedures, she had an entire network of trained pilots and proven capabilities available for deployment. Alert Squadrons Charlie and Delta for immediate deployment, Sarah ordered. Coordinate with Pacific Command for integrated response. And notify our allied partners that we may be implementing Joint Protocol 7. Joint Protocol 7 was the culmination of 18 months of international cooperation development. If implemented, American Shadowhawk pilots would coordinate real-time with British, Canadian, and Australian aircraft to create a multi-layered defense network that could engage multiple threats simultaneously across thousands of miles of airspace. Ma'am, The duty officer continued, "There's an additional element. The incoming aircraft are broadcasting identification codes that match friendly nations, but their flight characteristics and formation patterns are inconsistent with known Allied aircraft. Capabilities. The complication added layers of complexity to the response. Engaging aircraft that might be friendly forces would create international incidents with catastrophic diplomatic consequences, but allowing potentially hostile aircraft to reach populated areas because of identification uncertainty could result in civilian casualties. Implement Recognition Protocol Alpha, Sarah decided. Deploy Shadowhawk aircraft for visual identification and threat assessment. Do not engage unless hostile intent is confirmed through direct action." As alarms sounded throughout the facility, and pilots sprinted toward their aircraft, Sarah realized that this moment represented the ultimate test of everything they had built. Not just the training techniques and aircraft modifications, but the international cooperation, tactical innovation, and leadership development that had emerged from a single night of aerial combat 18 months earlier. "General," Sarah said to Hayes as they moved toward the operations center, "if this engagement succeeds, it will validate everything we've invested in this program. If it fails, we'll discover what we still need to learn." The operations center buzzed with controlled urgency as tactical displays showed the developing situation. 15 aircraft in perfect formation, approaching at speeds that exceeded conventional fighter capabilities, broadcasting friendly identification, but demonstrating flight characteristics that suggested technology beyond current Allied inventories. Shadowhawk. "Leader, this is base control." Sarah spoke directly to the lead pilot preparing for deployment. "You are authorized for full tactical response, but remember that positive identification is required before weapons release. These may be friendly forces with advanced capabilities we haven't been briefed about." "Understood, Base Control," came the reply from Major David Kim, who had emerged as one of the program's most capable graduates. "We'll get close enough for visual confirmation before making any engagement decisions." As the Shadowhawk aircraft lifted off and climbed toward the unknown formation, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months earlier, she had been a grounded pilot facing systematic discrimination and institutional opposition. Tonight, she commanded the most advanced aerial combat capabilities in the world, supported by international allies and proven techniques that had redefined modern air warfare. But the most significant transformation wasn't in aircraft technology or pilot training. It was in the recognition that exceptional capabilities often emerged from individuals who had been dismissed or overlooked by conventional evaluation systems. The discrimination that had nearly ended Sarah's military career had inadvertently preserved her for the moment when her unique abilities became essential for national defense. "Colonel," General Hayes observed as they watched the tactical display, "show Shadowhawk aircraft approaching the unknown formation. Regardless of what happens tonight, you've already changed military aviation permanently. The pilots we're training, the international cooperation we've developed, and the techniques we've proven will influence air warfare for decades." Sarah nodded, understanding that the legacy of Project Shadowhawk extended far beyond any single engagement or threat response. They had demonstrated that human potential could be developed beyond previously accepted limitations, that international cooperation could transcend traditional barriers, and that innovation often required challenging fundamental assumptions about what was possible. "Contact established," Major Kim's voice reported from the lead Shadowhawk aircraft. "Visual identification confirms. These are definitely not conventional Allied aircraft. Design characteristics are unlike anything in current inventories. They're acknowledging our presence, but maintaining course toward populated areas." The moment of truth had arrived. Everything they had built, trained for, and prepared over 18 months would be tested in the next few minutes. But Sarah felt confident in ways that went beyond personal capability or advanced training. She was supported by a network of exceptional pilots, proven techniques, and international partnerships that represented the evolution of air warfare into something more collaborative and more effective than traditional military aviation. All Shadow Hawk aircraft, Sarah transmitted on the secure tactical frequency. You are cleared to engage. Protect American airspace and civilian populations. Show them what we've learned. As the engagement began over the Pacific Ocean, Sarah knew that whatever the outcome, they had already succeeded in the most important mission, proving that exceptional individuals could achieve impossible things when given the opportunity to demonstrate their true capabilities. The systematic opposition that had tried to ground her had instead prepared her to lead a transformation that would protect American skies for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.